Welcome back to the Remnant Christian Book Reading. My name is Vincent, and I hope you guys are ready for today's reading. We're gonna be reading chapters 5 and 6. I don't remember what it is because I have it going continuous on the playlist. Um, but yeah, 5 and 6 of part 3, book 3 of the Elijah Project. I hope you're ready. Chapter 5 and 6 seem to be pretty cool. By the way, if you guys didn't already realize, I'm reading the book with you all. So if you ever hear me like kind of mess up or whatever, it's because I'm reading the book as I'm doing the videos with you. Of course, I've read the book beforehand, so I know what's somewhat gonna happen, but I'm rereading it. I haven't read this book in maybe 5 years, maybe. I don't know, maybe less. But I haven't read it in a really long time. But all of that silliness aside, welcome back. Let's get into it. The Elijah Project, chapter 5 and 6. I hope you're ready because I am. Chapter 5 is titled On the Run. Piper wanted to be strong. She stood on the side of the road, trying to stop the tears from coming, but she couldn't. And with her hands cuffed behind her back, she couldn't wipe them away either. How could things get worse? Not only was she handcuffed, but so were Mom and Dad. Plus, her little brother had been kidnapped, and Zach was missing. Plus, they were on a road so remote, she doubted that they'd see any cars for the next hour or day or year. Maybe we should figure out where the nearest town is, Dad suggested, and start walking to it. What if Zach tries to come back here? Mom asked. Dad sighed. She was right, of course. But he found it almost impossible to wait around when his youngest child was in such great danger. Are you okay, sweetheart? Piper looked over to see her mother watching her. Yeah, she sniffed, then glanced away. I'm fine. But she knew she wasn't. And she knew Mom knew. We can't let ourselves get discouraged. Piper could hear the thickness in her mother's voice. She knew she was talking as much to herself as to her. We're gonna be all right. God's looking out for us. Piper blew the hair out of her eyes and breathed out, slow, in a long, quiet sigh. If this was God's version of looking out for him, she'd hate to see what would happen if he didn't. It wasn't that she doubted God. She knew he existed and all. But if he was supposed to be so loving, why had he just let all this hard stuff happen to them? Why didn't he just... Shh! Dad motioned them to get down. There's something in the woods. Piper turned to look behind them. It was true. Something was moving in the bushes. Dad eased himself protectively in front of Mom and Piper. Not that he could do much with his hands cuffed behind his back. The rustling came closer. What is it? Mom whispered. A bear? Dad motioned for them to crouch closer to the ground. They did so, still peering into the darkness. It was 15 feet away. Should we run? Piper whispered. Dad shook his head. It kept coming. It was just 10 feet away now. Now Piper could make out a shape in the shadows. It was big and dark. 8 more feet. Almost the size of a man. Piper watched, refusing to look away. If she was going to die, she wanted to know how. She wanted to see it coming and face it down. 7 feet. It was nearly on top of them. For the briefest second, she caught a glimpse of what might be a face. 6 feet. Suddenly, it opened what must have been its mouth and let out the world's biggest belch. This was immediately followed by a terrible stench. A stench that can only come from nuclear burrito, Piper cried. Hey, everybody, Zach grinned. Dad can only shake his head. Zachary. Before he could continue, Zach stepped aside. Look what I found! And there behind him stood little Elijah, smiling his biggest smile. Woof! The family walked the twisting mountain road for nearly half an hour before they stumbled upon their vehicles. Above them, on the hillside, Shadow Man's thugs were searching the forest, the beams of their flashlights crisscrossing back and forth. What's going on? Zach whispered. They're searching for Eli, Dad whispered. What do we do? Dad motioned them back behind some boulders. Once there, they worked out a plan. Piper listened, trying to concentrate, but it was hard to pay attention with the handcuffs cutting deeper and deeper into her wrists. Finally, the plan was set. Since Zach had no handcuffs, he went first. He dashed across the road to the Jeep, keeping as low as possible. Once he arrived, he quietly opened the back door, leaving it open. He crossed around the other side, opened that door, and slid in behind the wheel, where he ducked out of sight. Now it was Elijah's turn. He ran across the road and dove through the back door that Zach had left open. Next came Piper. It was hard for her to climb into the car with the handcuffs holding her arms behind her back. Zach and Elijah pulled, and she twisted and squirmed until she finally made it inside. Then it was Mom's turn. And finally, Dad, who took some extra pulling. Once everyone was inside, Elijah quietly pulled the door shut. Okay, Zach, Dad whispered. Go for it. Zach turned on the ignition, and the Jeep roared to life. In the woods, the flashlights stopped moving. They all turned and merged into one giant beam, pointed at the Jeep. Zach hit the gas. The tires spun, spinning gravel, and the family took off. Piper looked over her shoulder to see the flashlights bouncing to the cars. It would take a couple minutes before they arrived and started after the family, but she knew they would soon be coming. Zach pressed the accelerator, picking up speed. Be careful, son, Dad warned. These curves are sharp. Zach nodded and slowed slightly. For a moment, silence filled the car. But Piper had too many questions for it to last long. Dad? Yes. Now's probably not a good time to ask, but... Go ahead, he said. Ask away. Okay, I'm wondering. I mean, if it's not too much bother, could you tell us, what's going on? She didn't mean to yell. It sort of just came out that way. Mom and Dad traded looks. Dad arched an eyebrow. Mom hesitated and then gave a little nod. Dad returned it and began. We can't tell you everything, because those thugs want the same information. The less you know, the safer you will all be. But we can tell you this much. He took a breath. Your brother is, well, he's special. Thanks, Zach called from behind the wheel. Not you, Piper said. You're special too, Dad chuckled. And then he grew serious. It's just, well, there's a lot more to Elijah than you realize. Piper looked over to her little brother, who was curled up in Mom's lap, his eyes already closed. It wasn't a big surprise. Lots of times when everybody was nervous, he was completely relaxed. Other times, when everyone was relaxed, he was nervous. Mom looked at Elijah and continued the explanation. We knew something was up when he was a baby. Like what? Zach asked. Oh, just little things. Such as... Once again, Mom traded looks with Dad. I don't think you're ready for that information, Dad said. Not just yet. Zach grunted his disapproval from the driver's seat. We'll tell you when it's time, Mom said. But for now, the important thing to know is that Elijah is special and that there are others, an organization of others, who also know it. That's why they want him? Because he's special? Zach asked. Yes. But there's something else. Piper turned to Dad, waiting for more. He hesitated, just a moment before continuing. We're in a battle. We've been in one for a while, but now it's getting worse. Zach motioned over his shoulder. You mean with those goons back there? Dad shook his head. It's more than that. It's a spiritual battle. Like the devil and stuff? Piper asked. Dad nodded. Yes. She felt goosebumps rise and crawl across her arms as a shiver went through her body. Zach had a different response. Cool! Piper cleared her throat. That sounds kind of, scary. Dad shook his head. It doesn't have to be. Remember, as Christians, we have power over the enemy. Piper did remember, but it didn't make her any more relaxed. That's the war we're fighting, Dad said. And that's the war we are going to win. Piper looked from her mother to her father. She was grateful for their faith, and she had little doubt that they had enough to succeed. She just wasn't sure she did. She looked out the window in time to see a jagged fork of lightning cut through the darkness. A moment later, the thunder followed, pounding and rolling through the sky. Meanwhile, in the Hummer, Shadow Man was in no hurry to catch up with the family. The tracker attached to the bottom of the Jeep would always tell him where they were. No matter what they tried or what they did, the family would never be able to get away. Never. And that is the end of chapter 5. Very, very good. Let's go straight into chapter 6, titled The Crash. I hope that they didn't crash. But let's see. Zach glanced into the rearview mirror. He knew the bad guys weren't far behind. Up above, the sky flashed with bright, jagged forks of lightning. Thunder rumbled as Dad continued his discussion on spiritual warfare. Remember when you were all kids, Dad said, how I made you memorize Ephesians 6 from the Bible? How could we forget? Zach groaned. You had to say it like 1 billion times. Do you still remember it? Dad asked. Piper spoke up from the back. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers. Reluctantly, Zach joined in. Against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. Dad nodded. And the next verse? Zach frowned. But Piper continued. Therefore, put on the full armor of God, so that when the day of evil comes, you may be able to stand your ground. Very good, Dad smiled. I guess you were listening after all. Mom spoke up. And do you remember the weapons God gives us to fight with? That one's easy, Zack said. The sword of the Spirit, which is the word of God. And the shield of faith, Piper added. And prayer, Zack added. It's not on the list, but we've seen it do some major damage. He glanced in the mirror and spotted his sister. And don't forget worship, Piper said. Like singing to God and stuff. Mom agreed. The devil really hates that. Remember how we used to sing, Jesus loves me, this I know? As the family nodded, all remembering the radio suddenly crackled to life. Come in, Dawkins family. Dawkins family, can you hear me? Everyone froze. Until Zack broke out laughing. What is that? Mom asked. Not what? Zack grinned. Who? It's Willard. Good old Willard. On a radio? Dad motioned out the window. Look at that! Two shapes were flying about a dozen feet above the car and to the right. It's Willard and Cody! Zack exclaimed. At least he thought it was. It was kind of hard to tell with them hanging upside down and all. It was even harder to tell when Willard zigged and zagged, just missing a billboard. Unfortunately, Cody wasn't quite so lucky. He zagged when he should have zigged and busted through the billboard. Oh no! Piper pressed against her window and watched the aerial acrobatics. Now they were bouncing up and down like jet-propelled pogo sticks. This time it was Cody's voice they heard over the radio. But it didn't do much talking. In fact, it was just one word. Still, you could definitely tell he wasn't thrilled about what was happening. Willard! A moment later, and Willard's voice came back on the radio, Dawkins family, listen up. There is a transmitting device planted on your Jeep. You're being tracked and must... Lightning lit up the sky around them, and static filled the radio. Are they all right? Mom gasped. Dad leaned forward to look up through the windshield and search the sky. So did Zack, which explains why he didn't see the sharp bend in the road just before the bridge. Look out! Dad shouted, but it was too late. The Jeep shot off the side of the road, and suddenly they were airborne. Mom and Piper screamed as the car sailed through the air, heading straight for the river. Hang on! Dad yelled. The nose of the car dropped, and Zack braced himself as the river raced toward them. Everybody hang! They slammed into the water. Zack's seatbelt dug right into his chest as airbags exploded all around. The Jeep righted itself and floated as icy cold water poured in through the floorboards. Everyone was shouting and screaming. Zack tried to open his door but couldn't. His mind raced, remembering something he heard. How if a car goes underwater, the outside pressure keeps the door shut. Roll down your windows! He yelled. That's crazy! Piper shouted. We don't want to let in more water! He's right, Dad shouted. Do it! Elijah obeyed. He reached past Piper and cranked down the window as fast as he could. That's when the horror hit Zack. His mother, father, and sister were all handcuffed. They had never been able to swim out. They'd never be able to swim out, He'd have to save them all. The river rose to their laps and continued filling the car. Zack reached into the water, found the seatbelt, and unbuckled himself. He bent and squirmed until his head and shoulders were out the window. Then he pulled himself the rest of the way. Zack! Dad shouted. He turned to see his father struggling to open his own window. Grab Piper! Zack nodded, panting heavily, and swam back to Piper's side. The water was up to her chest now. She'd managed to get her head through the window and was pushing against the seat with her legs. But with her hands cuffed behind her back, she could go no further. "Zach, help me!" she cried, her eyes full of panic. He grabbed her shoulders and pulled. She yelped as her stomach scraped across the window until she was finally out. But there was still no way to swim with her hands cuffed. He wrapped his arm around her waist. Together they kicked and swam against the icy current. More than once they went under, but they kept fighting back up, choking and coughing until, at last, Zach's feet hit the river bottom, then Piper's. They sloshed and stumbled toward the bank until they arrived and collapsed into the muddy shore. But where were the others? Zach spun around to look. The jeep had sunk almost to its roof. Without thinking, he dove back into the river and swam toward it. Gasping for air, he finally arrived. Elijah was helping Mom out. Dad had managed to open his window, but he was too big to make it through the opening and the door was jammed. Zach took a gulp of air and dove underwater to re-enter the jeep through its side. His father's face was up to the ceiling, gulping breaths from the shrieking pocket of air. Zach tucked in his legs and spun around until his feet landed against Dad's door. He kicked it once, twice, 3 times before it finally gave way and opened. With lungs burning for air, he pushed out through his window and resurfaced, taking in deep, gulping breaths. He turned and spotted Dad outside the car, frantically kicking his feet to stay above the water. "Hang on!" he shouted. He swam around the car and grabbed the back of Dad's shirt. Together they kicked and swam towards shore, where they finally arrived, exhausted. "Elijah!" Mom cried. They turned to see Mom, who had also arrived, obviously with the help of Elijah. But the little guy was nowhere to be found. "The current!" she cried. "It carried him away!" She staggered to her feet, searching. "He was here and then... Elijah!" Zach rose to his knees, also looking, also shouting, "Elijah! Elijah!" And then he spotted him on the other side. The outline of a man was reaching down and pulling him out of the water. Joy filled Zach. They made it. Despite the crash, despite everyone nearly losing their life, they were all safe and sound. Well, not quite. Because Dad had also spotted Elijah. And instead of shouting or cheering, he gasped a single word, a name that chilled Zach even more than the icy water. Shadow Man. And that is the end of chapter 6. That was pretty good, huh? Intense. Well, I hope you all enjoyed it. And isn't that interesting how their dad made them memorize Ephesians 6? I think that is something that us as Christians should all try to memorize. That the power and the might is with God, and when you have his armor on, you're able to stand against Satan. That is amazing, and it's a good verse to memorize. If you don't know it, it's in Ephesians 6, 10, 11, 12, and onward, the rest of the chapter. That chapter in the Bible is so important for us to always memorize, especially nowadays. But with that said, I'm happy you guys joined me for another book reading. Thank you so much for watching, and if you really enjoyed it, go ahead and give me a like, and if you want to, go ahead and put down your predictions of what you think is going to happen next with Elijah, now that Shadow Man has him. Thank you so much for watching. Once again, I want to say it again because it's awesome that everyone is watching. Thank you so much. I appreciate you guys always coming and tuning in. It really helps me out to know that there are people out there who actually care to listen to me read the book. So with that being said, thank you so much. God bless you. And remember that Jesus loves you very much. Bye-bye, everyone.